What is HelloFresh? With HelloFresh, you get farm fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. Skip the trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. Fall is right around the corner, and HelloFresh is there to help you plan for the busy season ahead with tasty dishes delivered right to your door. You just simply choose recipes and pick your delivery date, then lay back and enjoy the last days of summer, knowing that dinner is covered. Parents have enough back-to-school shopping and planning to do. Let HelloFresh get the groceries and save you some cash with pre-portioned meals, again, delivered right to your door. So when life gets busy, don't call for delivery, go with HelloFresh. I've been using HelloFresh for a while now, and I cannot tell you how much simpler making dinner has become. It really does give me one less thing to worry about. So go to HelloFresh.com/50WhoKilled and use code 50WhoKilled for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com/50WhoKilled and use code 50WhoKilled for 50% off plus free shipping. Slow Burn Media, an evergreen podcast, presents Who Killed, a podcast that provides a voice for the voiceless.
A suspect is in custody in connection with the stabbing deaths of 4 University of Idaho students last month. Authorities sorted through thousands of tips and tracked Brian Kohberger more than 2,000 miles away from the murder scene to his parents' home in Pennsylvania's Pocono Mountains. As Danya Backus reports, police are trying to determine a motive for the killings.
What I can tell you is we have an individual in custody who committed these horrible crimes.
After 19,000 tips in a quadruple murder case that drew nationwide attention,
Detectives arrested 28-year-old Brian Christopher Kohberger.
Kohberger was arrested at his parents' Pennsylvania home. The 28-year-old is a PhD criminology student at Washington State University, just a 10-minute drive to the Idaho campus. Kohberger is being held without bail and will spend the weekend in Pennsylvania. His extradition back to Idaho expected next week. The arrest caps nearly 7 weeks of fear and frustration for families of the 4 murdered students.
This is the first bit of joy that we've had in close to 7 weeks. We hope that they've picked the right guy, and that gives us hope, and we haven't had hope for a long time.
Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin all stabbed multiple times as they slept inside this house near the campus. Despite surveillance video showing the victims in the hours before they were murdered, and despite thousands of tips pouring into the Moscow Police Department, there appeared, at least publicly, to be little movement on the case. No suspects, no arrest. As the grief mounted and many students left campus. Outside the house, the caution tape has finally come down.
No arrest will ever bring back these young students. However, we do believe justice will be found through the criminal process.
The district attorney who will eventually prosecute Kohberger once he's back in Idaho says an arrest does not mean an end to the investigation. They are still searching for tips from anyone who knows the suspect. We should know more after the extradition hearing Tuesday in Pennsylvania. For CBS Saturday Morning, Danya Backus, Moscow, Idaho.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Who Killed. I'm your host, Bill Huffman, and this is, of course, a Slow Burn Media, evergreen podcast, and killer podcast production. On this week's episode, we are finally going to take a look at the case in Idaho. And you know the case I'm talking about. That would be the case of the Idaho 4. And these were the 4 victims that were tragically murdered on November 13th, late at night, by somebody wielding a fixed blade, according to authorities. Now, I did not want to do any episodes about this case where I speculated, and other shows have done it, and I have no problem with that whatsoever. I have a different approach. I wanted to be there when there was an arrest, and then I wanted to discuss what the next process would be in this investigation. So I waited until the arrest of Brian Kohberger, which occurred last Friday, finally, but the police did an incredible job with their investigation and keeping things close to the vest. So I actually applaud them very much so. And I think the families that were critical of them also have turned to the page as far as what they believe was good police work. And this week, I was hoping to get somebody that I really respect, and I was able to do that. And that was with a guest named Matt Mangino. He's been on before. He is a former prosecuting attorney for Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and he has written a book about the death penalty that came out in 2010. Now, he's also a talking head on law and crime, which can be found on YouTube and Facebook. And he also does local interviews with the local NBC stations. And it is very interesting to hear his insight into what these processes are coming in this investigation. Now, we know that Brian has been extradited. We know that there have been some updates in the case. And before we even got off the air today, there was an update. So the update comes as we discussed in this episode about the release of the affidavit. And I'm guessing this is where some of this information came from. Now, it turns out that Brian Kohberger had stalked the home of the victims at least 12 times, and that's according to cell phone data pings. And he apparently turned off his phone during the homicide. Now, that is something that one would do knowing how criminology works. Now, unfortunately, he also made one major mistake, and he actually left the sheath for the knife with his DNA on it next to one of the victims. So clearly not the brightest bulb in the class or the chandelier. Now, this is crazy, and definitely the things are breaking as we talk. And again, this is one of those cases where things are moving constantly. So now that we know a little bit more about what they knew about Brian and why they leaned on him, I think that will make for a little bit more understanding for the, I guess, listeners and for the people that were interested in this case to see how these investigators reached the conclusion that Brian Kohberger was most likely their man. Now, again, this is all happening as I just recorded an episode on January 5th at 11:06 Mountain Time, and it is crazy to think that all these things are happening, and we are finding out new information pretty much hourly now that he's back in Idaho and I believe has been arraigned. So this is, again, a breaking story, but join my conversation with Matt Mangino as we break down what the next steps are in the case against Brian Kohberger and justice for the 4 victims in the Idaho slayings. So join me as we break down this case and hear from an expert about what happens next. Hello and welcome to this very special episode of Who Killed. I am lucky enough to be joined again. This is his second appearance on Who Killed, and that is one Matt Mangino, and he is a former prosecutor from Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and he's also an author and an attorney and a talking head on television. Matt, thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's really great to be here. Unfortunately, we're here to discuss a topic that isn't so great, and that is the subject of the Idaho 4. What has your involvement been in this case? I noticed that you've been on a lot of Facebook interviews. I've seen you on interviews on NBC, local stations. You've been pretty familiar with this case from the beginning. Can you give us a little bit of background on how you got involved and exactly what it is that you do?
Well, it is truly a horrific case, and it has captured the attention of America. Certainly with the length of this investigation and kind of the manner in which the Moscow police and Idaho authorities kind of played it close to the vest. So as a public, we really didn't know what was going on, which led to a lot of speculation. As a result, I got to do some commentary for Law and Crime on the Law and Crime Network, and a local NBC affiliate that I do some expert analysis for, and even some other entities like Newsy and other things. So it's really been, from purely the perspective of someone involved in the legal system, kind of a fascinating evolution to this case. Certainly it's tragic. And as I said, it captured the attention of America, and rightfully so. 4 college students brutally murdered, and then really a period of time, where we know nothing about what's going on in the case. So it has this quick turnaround in the last week with regard to the arrest, and then some of the bits and pieces that are being filled in. But again, we have to be careful, because we don't know that these necessarily sources and statements that we're hearing right now are accurate, because we haven't seen the affidavit of probable cause, which has been sealed by the court, and I would assume would be made available soon. Once Brian Kohberger is arraigned in Idaho.
Now, that's an interesting question that brings up about the gag. I mean, they called it, a gag order, basically, is the slang term for this type of issue. But will we find out more through the release of this probable cause affidavit? I mean, do you think it will provide some sort of a map of what led them to Brian?
Well, I think it would. Typically, having been a prosecutor for a couple of terms in Western Pennsylvania, and obviously practicing criminal defense, oftentimes it was always my position as a prosecutor that I wanted to put the minimum amount of information that I could in an affidavit of probable cause. I wanted just to give enough information that would carry the day in terms of getting a warrant for arrest. I don't want to lay my whole case out in a 10-page affidavit of probable cause. Now, I'm not sure, what the authorities in Idaho, have done in this case. This is a little different. Certainly, they're kind of finding a needle in the haystack, and they may want to provide more information than normal to show how they've been able to find, Brian Kohberger in this situation. So I think the affidavit of probable cause will provide us with additional information, may fill in some of these blanks, may fill in some of what we've heard from sources, so to speak, in the last few days. So I think it's going to certainly give us more than we know right now, but it may not be the complete picture that some expect.
Well, I think that would be foolish on the part of the prosecutors to release the, like you said, you don't want to put too much information in there, lay out your case, and let it be picked apart before there is even, a trial or a grand jury or anything along those lines. I find keeping the things close to the vest in this case was the best thing they could have possibly done. I know they took a lot of flack from, one of the parents, and, he even came out and said after the arrest, he's like, well, they didn't tell us anything about this guy, and they did a hell of a job at keeping it, quiet, because apparently they knew of this individual prior to when he left, and he left on December 15th, and then he wasn't arrested again until the 30th? Late early morning on the 30th. And so they were following this guy for a while, and man, good police work. It takes time, and for them to be able to surveil this individual, I mean, is this kind of an unprecedented thing? Do they typically spend 2 weeks surveilling somebody? I mean, they had an Indiana police officer intentionally pull him over from a source.
Right.
Of course, don't want to speculate too much, but that's a pretty impressive feat, in my opinion.
Well, it is. It is impressive in terms of the manner in which they were able to keep all this information confidential. If I were a defense attorney, I would be a bit sort of anticipating, what additional information they found in this 2-week period. Certainly, it is unprecedented, so to speak. But why did they have to do it? Why didn't they think 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks now before Kronberger ever left Idaho that they didn't have enough to just grab him and arrest him there? I look at a case like this, that if you're trying to build more evidence and surveil somebody for 2 weeks, you might feel like you need more. You might not feel comfortable that what you have right now is adequate in terms of probable cause, or in the long run in terms of getting a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. So, from having my defense hat on, I want to look at this. I want to know, hey, were you on shore on January 13th or December 13th or December 15th before him and his father left Idaho, that you wanted to continue this investigation and this surveillance? So it's a double-edged sword, and we'll see how all that sorts out.
Yeah, that is it's a very good point. And I think from the defense perspective, you would think that, okay, it took you 2 weeks of surveillance to get the evidence you needed to support this probable cause affidavit, then, there might be some holes there. And it is interesting to think that they were able to do this with the help of the FBI, other law enforcement, and they were able to do this kind of on the sly. And, if Brian was so smart, he might be suspicious of this, if somebody's tailing you or something like that, you kind of pick up on it. I guess they just, I don't know, when you do something like this and you have somebody who is suspected of such a horrible crime that has literally paralyzed a community, and to know about it for 2 weeks before you made the arrest, I don't know. I see where you're coming from with the defense perspective, because it's like, well, what took so long?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, it does make you pause and think, what additional evidence did they think they were going to discover, through surveillance? Sometimes, there, people who commit crimes, and it could be anything from, a robbery to an arson to a homicide, like to return to the scene of the crime. They like to go back and just look at the flurry of police cars and forensic analysts and things like that. So maybe you're seeing if there's anything like that that occurred. Maybe you watch to see if someone flees. Now, so when someone flees, it can be indicative of guilt, that they're acknowledging their guilt and they fled. Now, in a situation like this, I don't think that you're going to be able to say that his returning to Pennsylvania was necessarily him fleeing. He waited for a period of time. He finished the semester. He waited for his father, apparently. He waited for his father, who, as I understand, again, from sources, that he had made plans early in the year that he would fly out and drive back with him. So this is not an indication of flight that we typically might see in a situation where someone scrambles after a crime and can't be located. So, it's going to be interesting to see exactly, what the authorities in Idaho learned after he became a target of their investigation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the most important thing to remember is the victims in this case, and that's really the victims and the families and the friends and the community that all really. I mean, wow! Like, talk about being impacted by an awful tragedy, a city that doesn't have murders, and then you have this individual. Now, sources, and I hate relying too much on this because we don't know exactly what they mean. And they say that he lived within a few minutes of this home, but that doesn't really say much other than. Did he live down the street? A few minutes could be anything. I mean, I'm a few minutes away from 1,000 people. So I don't know what to take from that. And I guess, in my opinion, the thing that they got him on, or at least that they narrowed the search down to him, clearly the DNA is what I think helped put this warrant into place. But the car. There's only so many cars, Hyundai Elantras, white Hyundai Elantras. More surprisingly, more than I thought, 90 of them were registered to park on the campus of the University of Idaho. Apparently, that's a very popular car there.
Right.
But, you think about this individual, and, if they figured out it was his car, and then they start looking at his background, I mean, red flags galore, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, again, we're dealing with sources, and we hear about this genetic genealogy that was used. So you find DNA, whether it be blood or other type of DNA, in the house that doesn't belong to any of the victims. You get that DNA, you run it through CODIS. If the defendant's never been arrested or involved in the legal system, you're not going to have a match. And it appears, again, from sources that they immediately turned to genetic genealogy, which then could connect this DNA with certain family members. And then you start to draw out this family tree of all possibilities. And then here you find someone nearby at Washington State University, and then you continue to connect the dots, and he's driving a white Elantra, which is something that you saw on video surveillance. So you see how that comes together, if in fact that's the way it came together. And again, we may know more about that once this affidavit of probable cause is made public. But you could see that would be really good police work. Very timely. It's unusual in sort of a real-time case to use this genetic genealogy. Where we have seen it repeatedly is in cold cases, where you're able to connect the dots, maybe years after a crime. But here you're using it real time, and it's kind of impressive if that's the way it was done.
Yeah, I think it's extremely impressive, and I think it's a step in a direction that I think all law enforcement probably is excited about, because if you can use this in real time, like they supposedly have, I think that changes a lot of investigations and the way that they can approach this kind of stuff, especially if there's an abundance of DNA that they can use to test. And I think that stems from, now, of course, the reports have always been that it was a blade that committed this crime. Obviously the individual wielding the blade. But, as a criminology student, you would think this guy would have thought about what he was going to do before he did it. And the fact that he used a knife, which is traditionally known to cause DNA to be left at a scene. I mean, this really wasn't that well thought out. If that was, if it was thought out at all, I don't know, because we don't know yet.
Well, right. So it's going to be, something that people are going to analyze. People like you and I are going to talk about. So he goes into a house with this blade. And, so what's his intention there? I mean, does he know these people? Is this a group of people that he's been stalking or following for whatever reason that might be? Is this a random, act? You see a couple of these young women, the victims outside, getting a sandwich at one of the vendors, and you follow them home. If you think about it, though, if you're going to plan something like this, a massacre like this, and it's 4 people that you intend to basically ambush while they're in bed, you're not going to use a gun because that's probably, when you shoot one of the victims, you're going to alert the others in the place that
fair point,
something's amiss, and then you have to confront these people. So. If you're going to kill them in their sleep, you're going to do it with a means that is not going to make a lot of noise. So I see using a blade or a knife is the way you want to go in that situation. Here, for whatever reason, 4 people were massacred, but 2 were left unharmed. Was this incident interrupted in some way? Was there something that caused the perpetrator to leave quickly? The DNA that was found at the crime scene that has allegedly been traced to the defendant, and as I understand, again, through sources, they were able to get some sort of discarded containers or a glass or a coffee cup that the defendant used, and were able to match the DNA found within the residence to him specifically as the investigation continued. And this is kind of a secret agent kind of spying work. You go into a restaurant or go through the garbage and find a cup or glass or something that has his DNA on it. But what kind of DNA was it that was discovered there? Was it actually blood? Was it touch DNA? I think one of the things that people are going to want to know, and investigators are ultimately going to have to divulge, is, was there some contact between the defendant and one or more of the victims? Okay, so was there a reason why? Is there a motive? Is this random, or is there a motive? Was there something between the victims and this defendant? So there's a lot of questions that we still don't know that will give us a clearer picture of why such a heinous massacre would occur. Why these 4 would look to be happy and successful students were slaughtered.
Yeah, these 4 students, Ethan and Madison. They were really. You had Kaylee, Ethan, and is it Xana? I don't want to pronounce it incorrectly. Yeah. And it's just, these were young, bright individuals who had careers lined up. I believe it was Kaylee that was going to be starting her career in the spring, and it's just so tragic to think that they were just on the precipice of their lives beginning. College is sort of the stepping stone to the next step in your life, which is, obviously that's, part of people, going to college and all that. But to know that these people had lives, families, friends, brothers. One was a triplet, and, that's just tragic. He has to live with that the rest of his brothers have to live with that the rest of his life. And it makes you wonder whether or not it was something that he had targeted, because these 2 individuals that were not attacked, if he had been, say, stalking the house, he would have known that there were two other people that were roommates, at least. I don't know if he would have known that they were there that night because they were not in, they were in another part of the house. But, again, if he was killing four, what's the other two? I don't know. I mean, do you feel like that's a sort of a sign that this was a targeted attack? Because they keep saying it's a targeted attack.
Well, I think, one of the things that we'll all do is try to figure out why something like this happened, or how could something like this happen. And unfortunately, we're never going to really know the answer to that question. Why would someone who allegedly a PhD candidate want to go into a house and slaughter these four vibrant young people who, as you said, were on their way to starting their life and their careers? I don't think we're ever going to be able to make sense out of that. We can figure out maybe what a motive was. We can figure out the means by which it was carried out. We can figure out how someone was able to escape that house after massacring these students. But we're never really going to know why something like this happens. And it's just a complete tragedy that is, as much as we try, we're never really going to make any sense out of it.
Yeah, you're correct in that regard. Do you find it interesting at all, or a connection that he was studying under like one of the most famed criminologists and serial killer experts in the country? I mean, is there any thought that this could have been just like testing his knowledge? I know that sounds just absolutely asinine, but we've seen crazy things happen before. So,
yeah. Well, that's an excellent point. Certainly he was studying in the field of criminal conduct, and he was he studied under a female professor in Pennsylvania who was renowned for her study of serial killers. That's an excellent question, and not only have we saw this sort of stuff in real life, but there have been great movies and books about sort of the criminal mind. A famous movie is Alfred Hitchcock's The Rope, where there's two friends who decide to kill another friend just for the thrill of killing. And I was involved as a prosecutor in a case, where a 12-year-old girl was murdered by three, men in their late teens, early 20s, who basically said it was a thrill kill. Something they talked about doing, they talked about, murdering somebody, and then ultimately murdered this 12-year-old girl. So there are, in real life and in fiction and literature, countless situations where people have just killed for the thrill of killing.
I mean, it brings back Leopold and Loeb, one of the first major murder cases of any, teenagers in this country. Right. Those were kids that thought they were smarter than everybody else, and they wanted to pull off a murder, but they were not the smartest kids in the class either, because they picked somebody that they knew. And it's like these people who do these crimes, and yes, they make movies about them because they do happen in real life, and it is crazy to think. I mean, the Golden State Killer had a criminology degree. BTK had a criminology degree. people interested in this field study that stuff. I mean, again, if anybody looked at either of our searches or web services, they'd probably think, oh man, they're pretty shady too. But on a different side of things, we're investigating stuff, not so much investigating how to commit crime. But that to me was something that stood out big time when I found out he was a criminology professor. Or not a professor, criminology student, PhD student nonetheless. Gosh, it really made me think about what his motives were getting into that field. Can't help it.
Right. I mean, it's just, another plot twist, so to speak, in this case that really adds to this sort of frenzy about gaining more information and finding more out about this defendant and finding more out about the case, and I think that's what fuels this this interest, because there are so many dimensions to it that still have to reveal themselves.
Yeah, I think the fact that it happened in a sleepy, quiet, college town. Moscow, Idaho, I live out west, and, that's up there in the peninsula of Idaho. And it's a gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous part of this country. And to think that these people who barely ever lock their doors now lock their doors at night because, well, hopefully there's a little bit of peace, but now they're scarred for life because of this. And so that will probably change their routines forever. And for the students that had to experience this will stick with them for the rest of their lives as well. And so I'm just hoping that this arrest and what will be following this arrest will provide, it's not so much about us. I don't care. I mean, again, I never cared that they kept things close to the vest. That was the whole point of the investigation. You don't tell people what they're doing. You don't go to the media and say, this is what we have, and we hope you guys help us. That's magical thinking. And if you think that that's how the investigators go about their business, then reassess yourself and change the channel. Whatever you're watching, it's not correct. But the fact that they can do this stuff and keep the parents at bay while they're kind of pursuing this one individual. I have to give just the police just a ton of credit for not being one of a police service or a police department that is used to this crime. And they called in the state police right away, which was super smart. I mean, do you think that was a really smart move on their part?
Well, yeah, I do. There are many communities across the country that have, relatively small police departments. People would be surprised to know in Pennsylvania, I mean, we literally have hundreds of police departments that might have, one full-time and 3 part-time police officers. Those police departments are just not capable of handling a homicide investigation, especially something of this magnitude. Now, this police department was certainly larger than that. You had a college campus there. There's a lot more activity. But again, I think it was prudent to seek as much help as you could, especially when they realized the magnitude of this case. And then not only that, they were assisted by the FBI. The FBI, again, as sources have said, were basically heading up the surveillance, from Idaho to Pennsylvania. We learn again from sources that they asked for the vehicle to be pulled over by local police in Indiana. Ultimately, I think that's something that will be closely scrutinized in this case, especially if there's anything that they plan to use from those stops. They are pretextual stops. One for following too closely, one for speeding. I certainly would want to scrutinize both of those situations if I was defending this case, especially obviously if they were going to try to use something from those stops, either something that was said or something that was captured on their body cam, wounds on the hand or something like that. That I think that will get some real scrutiny.
That's interesting, and I love that you have that defense attorney's perspective, because you're right. Those are pretextual stops, which are technically not allowed to occur. So the evidence in those cases, in your opinion, you could fight that.
Well, I would certainly look at it. I mean, unfortunately, a pretextual stop. I mean, so let's say a police officer suspects that something is awry, and there's people in a car. They can follow that car until they do something wrong. They fail to use a turn signal, whatever the case may be, and they pull them over, and that's a pretextual stop. And unfortunately, the courts have said, yeah, you can do that. This, at least again, based on the sources, is a little different. You're in a patrol car, and the FBI contacts you and says, pull this car over. Okay, so now you're on the highway trying to find a reason to pull this car over. First thing I'd want to look at is how often the Pennsylvania or the Indiana State Police pull people over for following too closely, on the interstate highway. Speeding's a different thing. How did you determine that speeding? Did you use radar? Was the car going 3 miles over the speed limit, which you rarely ever see, or was it going 15 miles over the speed limit? So those are the kind of things that I would want to know. Again, only if they were attempting to use something that was captured on video or something that was said by either one. If they don't plan to use any of that, then it doesn't matter. But if they do, I think those kind of things are going to be closely scrutinized.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting, another interesting plot point in this whole investigation. And when you have, the FBI dictating to Indiana State Police officers, I can, having driven across Indiana many times, and I'm sure you have as well, you rarely see a lot of police officers. And, that can go all the way to Colorado, where I am. I mean, I've been through Iowa before and never even seen a cop. It's very possible. It happens. And so I do see that your perspective on that part of the case is certainly warranted and certainly interesting too, because it does seem like an unusual move, but something like you would see in a movie more so than you would see in real life. I mean, we've all seen the digging through garbage and that kind of stuff, but this just seems like a big operation that involved more than just one department, more than one law enforcement agency. This is really impressive police work, in my opinion. With that being said, from the defense perspective, what would you be looking for in these next few days as far as what when they do bring your client in, or Brian, this client in, obviously he's not your client, but if he was your client, when they bring him in, do they give you all the information that they've had up to that point? I mean, how much disclosure do they give you?
Well, I would think initially, when he is arraigned, a preliminary arraignment. So this would be sort of the first step in the court process. He's going to come to court. They're going to tell him what the charges are. They're going to tell him that he has the right to counsel, which I think there's already a woman, Ann, I think is her name, Ann Taylor, She's an experienced criminal defense attorney, a public defender. I believe she's already asked the police to have her investigators look at the house, go into the interior of the apartment, the exterior, and things like that. So she's already hit the ground running. But I think initially, if it's anything like Pennsylvania, the jurisdiction that I practice in, all you're going to get at that first preliminary arraignment is a copy of the criminal complaint, which has already been made public, and then this affidavit of probable cause. And really, that's all that you're entitled to until you have a probable cause hearing in this case. Okay. And even then, you're not going to be provided with additional information. Occasionally, a police officer might read from a report, and then you can say, well, listen, if he's going to read from the report, then I want a copy of the report. But oftentimes, the police officers will really just use that affidavit of probable cause because that's all you really need. The burden at that early stage of a criminal prosecution is very low. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. So again, as I said earlier, if I'm prosecuting this case, I'm putting the least amount of evidence that I can in front of the judge or magistrate, however it's handled in Idaho, and getting this case bound to trial. Then what happens is the discovery process begins. Okay. And formally, defense counsel requests discovery, and maybe some specific discovery if there are reports, if there are interviews, if there are taped interviews, audio interviews, whatever it might be. Then you begin to accumulate all that information in preparation for trial. And normally there's a specific time limit within which discovery is provided, and then defense counsel has to file pre-trial motions. So if you're going to challenge the evidence, if you're going to challenge the stops along the road in Indiana, if you're going to challenge any statement that he might have made while he was in the custody of the Pennsylvania authorities, everything. To give you an example, in Pennsylvania, what we refer to it as an omnibus pretrial motion, which means everything you're going to raise, you got to raise it in that omnibus motion. So if you want to change a venue, all those things that might come up, suppression issues, all those issues are put into that single motion, and then you begin to go through the pretrial hearings. So I would assume, if there's going to be a zealous defense in this case, and there's no reason not to think so, defense counsel's already gone out to look at the house and other places and has a team of investigators together, that this process is not going to move quickly.
Yeah, and so that I really want to know the ins and outs a little bit about this public defender. Now, she's renowned for being, I guess, a high quality public defender. She's, I think, gotten somebody else exonerated for murder. How does that go about? How does this individual go about acquiring her services if she's a public defender? I mean, do you get a choice in this matter? I mean, how does that work? I really don't know.
Yeah, so again, I can't speak specifically for Idaho because every state is different in terms of how they go about, making that decision of, who's going to represent who. For instance, again, in Pennsylvania, we're the only state in the country that does not provide state funding for public defenders. So every individual county in Pennsylvania, there's 67 of them, each county has to pay all of the public defender costs. So if you can imagine, in a small county in Pennsylvania, where a high profile crime occurs, it could wipe the whole county out. After you think about criminal defense and investigators and experts and all the things that go into defending a case, because you can't say, oh, we're not going to give you the money to do that. I mean, you have to be able to present the best possible defense possible, and it could cost literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and in a small county that could be devastating. So I know that Idaho is different. I'm sure they get some state funding, however that works, local, state. But the process is, if he's a student, so he's not working, he doesn't have income, so he's going to be eligible for a public defender. He's going to be eligible for free legal representation. That's a fundamental issue. In the United States, the Supreme Court has said that if you can't afford an attorney will be appointed to represent you, especially in a potentially capital case like this. So how does that happen? I don't know if the court appoints that person. A lot of times in counties as well, is you might have a public defender's office. So you might have 10 attorneys in there. And each of those attorneys are handling hundreds of cases, literally. All of a sudden you have this huge high profile case. It would overwhelm the public defender's office. So instead of taking a public defender out of that office and appointing them as counsel, you might have a mechanism where independent counsel is appointed to represent this person. Again, paid by the county or the state. They're a public defender, but they're independent of the public defender's office because the case of this magnitude could overwhelm the public defender's office. Again, I'm just speaking on experience from my own jurisdiction, but I would think that it's a similar process in Idaho.
That is a very insightful perspective, because, again, I didn't realize that when the counties had to pay for it, I did assume that the state would be the one to foot the bill. Now, I know that other states, like you mentioned, they'll put an independent counsel in there. That that makes sense, especially if you need somebody that's going to be a top-notch, investigator, lawyer, with all the bells and whistles.
Right, and one of the other things to consider in a lot of states, in order to say this case ultimately turns into a death penalty case, in order to represent somebody as a defendant who's charged with a capital crime, you have to have certain specific training. So not every lawyer can try a capital case. You have to be qualified to represent somebody in a capital case. Now, a lot of public defenders' offices may only have one or two attorneys that are qualified to handle death penalty cases. So it limits the amount of available choices for those representing somebody in a capital case.
Yeah, and we talked about this before we came on the air, and that was about how often or I should say how little they use the death penalty in both Pennsylvania and Idaho. And what are the chances that this does become a capital murder case where the death penalty is definitely on the table? And do you see it going that way?
Well, in order for the prosecution to pursue a death penalty, there has to be what are called aggravating circumstances. Okay, so beyond someone just committing first-degree murder, okay, you have to have certain aggravating factors. So to give you an example, some of those aggravating factors might be the age of the victim, whether or not this person has prior felonies, whether or not this crime was committed in the course of committing another felony. So there's a lot of aggravating factors, and that might be, if you notice the charges, there's 4 homicide charges, and then there's a burglary with the intent to, commit serious bodily injury or something. That might be there just to add that aggravating factor that's needed for purposes of the death penalty. So there's a lot of aggravating factors. So once the prosecution determines, well, we have a charge of first-degree murder and we have these aggravating circumstances, then they put the defendant on notice that they're going to seek the death penalty.
Okay.
And that's required. And the interesting thing about Idaho is, the death penalty has been around, since 1976, the modern death penalty, because, death penalty was struck down in 1972. It was back in 1976. And since that time, they've only executed 3 people in Idaho. I think the last one was in 2012. They only have 8 people on death row. So the question is, if you seek the death penalty, what's the likelihood that it's ever going to be carried out in Idaho? And certainly, when you just look at the facts and nothing else. The heinous ambush and slaughter of these 4 students, you would think, hey, this case cries out for the death penalty. But there are so many other factors that are involved in the process, and there's other considerations. Would this person plea for life without parole? At least then you have some closure, and you don't take the risk of trying this case. So there's a lot of things that are looked at and considered in a capital case.
Yeah, I didn't realize how many things have to go into play to get a death penalty on the table regarding these aggravating circumstances, just because you look at the crime from the forefront, and of course it's horrific. And so I think any layman is going to think, well, of course this is a death penalty case. But like you said, there are other things that go into play and things that can make it not a death penalty case, and whether or not the death penalty is even worth pursuing if it's not even something that's being used. Because doesn't that just create more of a headache for the public, defense, or public, I should say, just the whole system gets thrown into whack and costs a lot of freaking money, with all the appeals and all the things that go into, somebody who's on death row. Do you think that would be a preventative?
Well, right. Yeah. There's no question that there's a lot of cost involved, because when someone's sentenced to death, there's really sort of like an endless series of appeals. First you might be appealing, the actual conviction, and then you're appealing the sentence, and then you're appealing the method of execution, and then you're appealing that you have some mental defect that prevents you from being executed. So those appeals and petitions to the court are endless, certainly when it comes to the death penalty. And the other thing is, with regard to the death penalty, is the anguish for the family of the victims. So you have someone who's sentenced to death, and repeatedly you endure these delays and these filings, and then you have executions scheduled and then delayed. So there's so many factors, and literally the time between conviction and actually having an execution carried out is probably more than 20 years right now on average. Okay. And then when you mix in those situations in which defendants have just given up their appeal rights and said, execute me, I'm done. In fact, in Pennsylvania, we've only had 3 executions since 1976, just like Idaho. But the 3 people who have been executed in Pennsylvania were all voluntarily executed. They gave up their appeal rights and asked to be executed. So Pennsylvania has had the death penalty on the books for 150 years or whatever the case may be. There hasn't been an involuntary execution in Pennsylvania since 1962. So we have 140 people on death row, but we haven't involuntarily executed anybody in 60 years. So you start to think about what's the sense of the death penalty. And so you have all these people on death row. You have all these family members of victims who keep wondering, when is the the killer of my daughter or my father or my brother, when are they going to be executed? So it really creates a lot of anguish for families of victims as well.
That's another way of looking at it that I hadn't thought of, because you are so right. Those appeals, those sentences, where they actually have something set where they're going to be executed and then there's a last minute delay. The emotions that these families must go through has got to be excruciating. And yeah, they're probably feeling a lot of the same feelings they felt when the crime was committed in the first place. And do we really, I mean, obviously I don't have any say in this, but is it worth it to put the families through that type of tragedy over and over again, especially when there is proven evidence that they don't really use the death penalty? My question next. Okay, sorry.
And as you know, we've talked about it before. I wrote a book on the death penalty.
Yes,
The Executioner's Toll. Yeah, 2010. And what I did in that book is I kind of examined all the executions in a single year, because most of the time people who write about the death penalty write from a certain bias. They're for it or against it. And I thought, what might be an interesting way to look at this is just, let's look at every case. Let's look at the facts. Let's look at the investigations, the trials, right through the appeals up to the last mills and the last words, and try to do it from an unbiased perspective and let the reader decide whether or not they support the death penalty. One of the things that struck me in that book is how many families of victims don't want the death penalty or are opposed to execution. Again, in what you hear is, justice has been done. He'll spend his life in prison. He can't hurt anybody else. And I can have some closure. I can put this behind me as best that I can. If I have to go through executions being scheduled and postponed and appeals, last minute appeals stopping executions, I relive, my family member, my loved one's murder over and over and over again. So there are people who acknowledge that that's not something that they want to endure, but they're in the midst of that right now and dealing with it.
Yeah, that book that you wrote, that is an incredible book. And I think anybody who's interested in the death penalty or the, ethics and the mechanisms that go into that would be well serviced by picking up that book. And, I'm assuming that book is available on Amazon and wherever you get your,
right.
Your
yeah,
books.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all the places you regularly find a book. So.
Yeah, and we've talked about that before. That was the original conversation that we had, was about your book. And I was so intrigued after we met at CrimeCon about that aspect of criminal defense, criminal prosecution, because it impacts you too as a prosecuting attorney. You have to make these decisions, and then you are kind of stuck with what you've let the jury come up with, and whether or not you feel good about it is not really your choice anymore. So I see where you're coming from when it comes down to, is this worth pursuing at the end of the day? Because really, it doesn't happen all that often, and the appeals are just so it's just rehashing everything. Every opportunity that they would have to make an appeal, they would take it, as they have the right to do. But for the families, I don't feel that is a fair way of going about it. But it is fair for the person.
Yeah, and the thing that's interesting about it is that, the death penalty is the most important decision that has to be made in the criminal justice system. I mean, so you're deciding whether or not ultimately this person is going to have to give up their life for the crime that they commit. I mean, what more important decision can there be, life or death? Yet, there's no really standard method in this country for determining whether or not a prosecutor will seek the death penalty. So, in Pennsylvania, for instance, and in most states, if not all, there's no process that says, well, you'll consider this when you're thinking about the death penalty, or you'll use this formula, or there are no guidelines. So the federal government has some process where a U.S. attorney would have to get the approval of the United States Attorney General to seek the death penalty. But there isn't anything like that in states. It's not like you have to go to the Attorney General of Pennsylvania or Idaho and say, can I seek the death penalty in this case? No. It's completely up to the elected, or in some states, appointed prosecutor. If that state has a death penalty, they decide without any real guidelines or structure whether or not they're going to pursue the death penalty.
That's a little flingy, floppy, whatever you want to call it. I don't know. That just seems a little, there should be a little bit more of a roadmap on how to get to this decision, because this is a lot of pressure that you put on the jurors and you put on the prosecuting attorney. Mm-hmm. And again, without a roadmap, it's really unfair. Now, I know you've got to get going. Is there anything that you have not said about the Idaho case that you feel is hanging out there still?
Well, no, I mean, I anticipate that affidavit of probable cause will be released shortly. And, we're going to have a better picture of what was involved in this investigation, and a better picture of what evidence that they have and that they will use to pursue a conviction in this case. It's always interesting, when you're determining whether to charge somebody as a prosecutor. It's not, the question isn't, do I have enough evidence for probable cause? Do I have enough evidence to get this case sent to court? I think, ethically, as a prosecutor, you have to look at every case from the outset and say, do I have enough evidence to prove this defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? That's the threshold for a prosecutor. Not, can I get this case bound to court? Not, can I get a warrant for this guy's arrest? But can I prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he's guilty? And I think we're going to learn more about that shortly.
Yeah, I do believe that we will find out more, and it probably will come within 24 hours of this episode going on the air. So hopefully we will find out more. Now, Matt, where would people be able to find you? I know you're active on Twitter, and give us some of your pluggables.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm on Twitter, and it's at Matthew T. Mangino, and my blog is mattmangino.com. And I write and post every day about issues that I think are important or people would be interested in. And even if you wanted to email me, you can. My firm is Luxenberg, Garbett, Kelly, and George, which is in Newcastle, and my email is mmangino, so MMANGINO at LGKG. Luxembourg, Garbett, Kelly, and George, lgkg.com.
Awesome. I really think you bring a great, I said perspective a million times in this episode, but it's so true because you see both sides of the field. And I think that is very important for the listeners and kind of the nuts and bolts of this whole case, really, because we aren't professionals as podcasters, and there's a lot of people out there that are making claims, that are doing things that are beyond the realm of what they should be doing. And it's important that I had somebody on that is as qualified as you to discuss this case. And I was waiting for the opportunity once somebody was arrested before I put my 2 cents in, because again, it's not, it doesn't involve me. It's about the investigation and getting the conviction. That's the most important thing. And Matt, I cannot thank you enough for coming on today.
Oh, thanks so much. It's always great to talk with you. You have a great program, a great podcast that I follow religiously. So it's an honor to to be on with you today.
Well, thank you. And if there is anything that comes up, is it okay that I reach out and maybe come back on again and discuss possible what's the next steps are going to be once we know more?
Please do. I'd love to come back.
Awesome. Many thanks to Matt Mangino for taking time out of his wild and crazy schedule to join me on Who Killed to discuss the case of the Idaho 4 and the case against Bryan Kohberger. So let's hope that with this investigation coming somewhat to a head for the time being, let's not forget about the victims, and that was Kaylee Goncalves and Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin and Madison Mogen. So, these are the people that matter, and as you know from the beginning of this episode, things are changing rapidly. By the time we ended up concluding this episode, things had already changed, meaning as far as what we knew as a public, there was more information released. I did give you some of that information. Again, it's changing rapidly, and news is being released pretty quickly at the moment. So check it out wherever you get your news. Again, thank you so much to Matt, and thank you so much to the listeners for listening this week. I wouldn't be here without you, and I promise you there will be more coverage on this case, hoping to get some more guests to discuss what is going to happen next. And again, you can follow me on Twitter if you want to know what's coming down the pike, and my username is @BillHuffman3. If you feel like donating to the show, you're more than welcome to with my Venmo username, and that's @Bill-Huffman-3. So again, thank you guys so much for tuning in to this week's special episode about the Idaho 4 and the arrest of one Bryan Kohberger, and having professional insight from one Matthew Mangino. So again, many thanks to everyone who helped make this show possible. And as always, stay healthy and be safe.
Women's Running Stories, where we explore the intersection between running and life. Because every woman who is committed to a running journey has a story to tell, and this is where you'll find those stories. I am host and producer Cherie Louise Turner. I'm a 53-year-old runner, and together with original music by musician and runner Cormac O'Regan, we bring these inspirational stories to life. Please join us to fuel your adventures.
Coming up on 5 Minute News, I'm Anthony Davis. You might think it's partisan because maybe it's critical of one side or the other, but it's not. It's just the truth. And I think that's also something that's kind of unusual for Americans listening to the radio or to podcasts, because the news landscape in the States has been so partisan for so many decades. So 5 Minute News is verified, truthful, independent, unbiased, and essential world news daily.